Welcome back to the program. Today we're joined by Max Blumenthal, the editor-in-chief at the Gray Zone. So, Max, you've covered plenty of U.S. interventions and regime change operations quite extensively, and you especially had a close focus on Venezuela for many years. You even interviewed the president himself.
Yeah.
From your perspective, do you see a credible indication about the US preparing for actual military action or some proxy style intervention in Venezuela? Because sometimes one gets the impression from Trump that he brings forth a problem which wasn't there, and then, he wants some concessions, to make it go away. Or do you think this is a genuine plan to invade or at least topple the government?
I'm looking right now at a New York Times article that just came out. Uh, Trump weighs options for attack on Venezuela. So obviously, it's something that's being seriously considered because every other option has run out and failed for the U.S. regime that has sought to topple the government of Venezuela since it changed its constitution and began nationalizing resources under the presidency of Hugo Chavez, who was elected in 1998. The first coup was in 2002. And so we're witnessing a rapid buildup on the basis of a completely phony narco-terror designation of U.S. forces, which are not enough to invade and take over Venezuela, but which are enough to wreak havoc. And the fact that the New York Times is putting forward all these options hypothetically demonstrates that I don't think the Trump administration or its so-called War Department actually knows what their plan is or what they're going to do. And I think it's possible that this could backfire, as so many other operations have inside Venezuela, while doing enormous damage, not just to Venezuela's economy and its people, but to the whole stability of the Western Hemisphere.
What are the main objectives, though? As you said, most people or almost all people I've talked to seem to be dismissing the whole idea of narco terrorism, but which isn't an interesting concept. But is this mostly about the oil, lithium? What are the main objectives? Uh, well, I know that Trump in the past has spoken quite fondly about what he would do, about the possibility of seizing the Venezuelan oil assets. But is it simply about natural resources, or are there more to this?
I mean, they have a contingency plan apparently to seize oil fields as well as airfields in Venezuela after disabling military bases and then capturing and or killing Maduro through some kind of special forces operation or decapitation strikes. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And they mean it. At the end of his speech in Quantico, where Pete Hegseth, the DUI hire of the so-called Department of War, called the military leadership fat and gay, and took a very subtle aim at black generals, which helped, I think, prompt the departure of the general who was to have directed this invasion, Halsey, who was the director of Southcom for the entire U.S. military and opposed this bonkers Trump administration plan and left. He, at the end of it, said that the U.S. needs to get back to wars like the first Gulf War. And a lot of people miss this, but Pete Hegseth put forward the first war on Iraq as a clean demonstration of American power with thousands of Iraqi troops surrendering that needed to be repeated. We've also heard Lindsey Graham refer to Grenada, the phony war that the U.S. staged in the Caribbean against a socialist government to basically remove a socialist government and give Reagan a political win. And Panama, the Panama deception, in which the U.S. labeled a former CIA asset, Manuel Noriega, who had gotten a little too big for his britches and was opposing U.S. intervention in Central America, they labeled him a narco lord, captured him, and meanwhile bombarded the country, leaving hundreds of civilians dead, destroying a neighborhood, a mostly Afro-Panamanian neighborhood in Panama City called El Chorrillo, displacing its residents and putting them in barbed wire internment camps, and then installing one of the most corrupt governments in history, and uh, which had about a 2% approval rating and turning Panama into a money laundering hub. These are the models for what the U.S. aims to do in Venezuela. The objective is to steal Venezuela's resources and rake in contracts, which will be distributed among Trump's business cronies. The Trump administration is a white-collar crime cartel, which is aiming to fulfill the wildest fantasies of the ghost of Dick Cheney, from Venezuela to Greenland to Central Asia. And we have uncovered details of these plans going back to 2019 at the Gray Zone from close Trump associates who were interviewed by the FBI. We have the FBI interviews as part of Operation Gideon, the mercenary invasion of Venezuela, which was led by this former Green Beret, Jordan Goudreau, which failed catastrophically. It was all blamed on Goudreau. He now faces federal arms trafficking charges. But the fact is, Goudreau appears to have been recruited for this by one of Trump's top security associates, Keith Schiller, who was Trump's bodyguard, handled security for Trump events, had an arms export license, is now lobbying for Pakistan, has been with his new company GreenMet in Greenland looking for rare earth minerals. And he had formed a company called Global Governments to get an invasion going or benefit from a regime change operation in Venezuela in order to rake in contracts for Trump cronies. That was the entire point of it. That's what Jordan Goudreau told me. That's what's clear from all the FBI interviews that we've seen. We're going to be coming out with a long investigation about this, and this will lay down the basis for what Trump is planning to do in Venezuela. But there's another motive there, and it's ideological. It's the motive of the figure who is taking ownership of this operation, Marco Rubio, who heads what I call the Gusano Industrial Complex, which is the nexus of the right-wing, anti-communist, so-called dissident communities of Latin America in South Florida who yearn to topple the governments of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and also off any left-wing leadership that might be in their way, from Lula da Silva to Gustavo Petro in Colombia. But these three top targets must be removed. It's their dream. It's been their fantasy since the Bay of Pigs. It's why they may have possibly been involved, or pretty clearly been involved, in the assassination of John F. Kennedy for failing to provide air support in the Bay of Pigs. I mean, this single-minded obsession of the Gusano Industrial Complex is driving Marco Rubio into a situation that could be his undoing if it goes wrong. And it's very likely to go wrong because it will destabilize Venezuela, could cause a civil war inside Venezuela between Chavistas and the fanatical right-wing opposition that the U.S. has backed, and it will lead to a massive migration wave, which has already destabilized the U.S.-Mexico border and helped fuel the rise of Donald Trump and his 2024 victory. So these are all, this is a very toxic equation, and the U.S. has done so much over the years to try to bring down Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, but everything has failed. And now they're just moving towards raw military force without any provocation, without any pretext, and conjuring up a phony narco-terrorist designation to justify the entire thing, to provide a seeming legal basis for what they're about to do, which means that they folded the phony war on terror of Dick Cheney into the phony war on drugs of Ronald Reagan in order to get this done.
Well, while the Trump administration is pushing this narco-terrorism as a reason for going into Venezuela, it appears that from Europe, or more specifically the Norwegians, offered an alternative legitimacy, though, fitting
Yep.
more within the tradition of liberal hegemony, where we can merge the more right-wing pursuit of hegemony with the more uh, yeah, ideology of spreading democracy and human rights through military force. And as well, let's call her an opposition leader, the generous Maria Corina Machado, who received the Nobel Peace Prize. But again, this is a bit seems it's a bit more on the nose than usual in terms of how blatant she is, though, in terms of encouraging military attack on her own country, to offering essentially the natural resources of her country to the Americans if they just come and invade. And I heard her also, I think, yeah, she blamed the Venezuelan president for being the mastermind behind the the election fraud in 2020 that stole the victory from Trump. I mean, she's quite an interesting Nobel Peace Prize winner, though. How do you make sense of this?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize has been fully discredited in broad daylight, and only one recipient of this prize had the foresight and dignity to actually refuse it. It was the anti-imperialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, sort of the the opposite, both politically and intellectually, of charlatans like Bernard-Henri Lévy, who supports regime change from Venezuela to Iran. Maria Corina Machado represents the nadir, the absolute decline of the credibility of the transatlantic class, which has supported the Gaza genocide, never put up any opposition to it, never even thought to support the nomination of first responders in the Gaza Strip or journalists in the Gaza Strip. They instead gave it to someone who was already at the forefront of a regime change war, of triggering a regime change war. In fact, it was Maria Corina Machado and her team which inspired the Trump administration to issue the narco-terrorist designation starting in January of this year, and to actually twist intelligence and fire U.S. intelligence officials who concluded that Nicolas Maduro had no connection to a Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, which Trump had accused of invading the United States. So Maria Corina Machado is the most radical figure of the US-backed Venezuelan opposition. She's more radical than the Juan Guaido faction. I was in Venezuela in 2019 when the Juan Guaido faction was preparing for a military coup. And I saw what they did in the streets of Venezuela, where they were attempting first a humanitarian intervention with USAID, ramming trucks through the Colombian border in order to compromise Venezuela's sovereignty, embarrass the government of Maduro, and to create the spectacle of Hamas, to create the sense in the international media that there was this hunger crisis caused by socialism. But Maria Corina Machado, on that same day, I witnessed her in Caracas attempt to lead goon squads and fellow upper class, mostly light-skinned Venezuelans to take over an airbase in Caracas called La Carlota, which went nowhere. They were screaming through the fences, trying to convince soldiers to come to their side. Nothing happened. And they eventually all went to lunch in the nearby neighborhood. They all had Italian food in the nearby neighborhood. So it failed. But on that same day, she and her colleagues in the most radical wing of the opposition issued a call for the United States to conduct a Libya-style military intervention in Venezuela. This followed her call for Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu to attack Venezuela and remove Maduro, following a formal partnership agreement she signed with Netanyahu and his Likud party. So this really tells you who she is and who the Nobel Prize Committee awarded. One of the most radical, fanatical figures in Latin American history, someone who I consider Pinochet in a skirt, who is pledged to purge her ideological opponents, millions of Venezuelans who are Chavistas, who are poor, who didn't exist in Venezuelan society before Chavez took power. She's called to purge them when she gets in power, promised to purge them when she gets in power. and she's catering to the forces that she thinks she needs to seize power through the most undemocratic means possible, a military intervention. And so, in an interview with Bloomberg last week, she declared that Maduro and his communication minister, Jorge Rodriguez, oversee a voting machine system that has rigged elections around the world, including in the United States, leading to Donald Trump's loss in the 2020 US presidential election. So she blamed Venezuela for rigging the US presidential election. And she obviously said this to get Donald Trump worked up enough to authorize the bombing of her own country. In addition to, as you mentioned, her repeated promises in her Bloomberg interview and an interview with Donald Trump Jr. To hand over her country's resources to various business cartels close to Donald Trump. So this is the figure who's supposed to take power. And I think it's important to note here that the New York Times and other liberal newspapers portrayed her as, they called her the Iron Lady, and portrayed her as a hero of democracy when she ran for president in 2024. And that was really the turning point, which led us to the current crisis.
It's extraordinary, though, but it does fit kind of with the past 30 years, that is, to give the Peace Prize to someone like her, because if we always make the point that democracy, that's peace, and democracy is delivered by military force, and the flaw, I guess, is that she represents democracy. But what I found very interesting is that Trump didn't seem to jump enthusiastically on this ideological justification that is spreading democracy. Instead, he's leaning heavy into this fighting narco-terrorism, which fits more within the, well, ironically, within the law and order category, which he wants to, well, build the legitimacy. But well, within, of course, law and order, it does beg some question about some of the already attacks being committed, primarily then on these Venezuelan boats. This is perplexing to many, because Venezuela is quite a far stretch from the U.S., from the United States. How do you make sense of these attacks on these ships? Because certainly, if they are carrying drugs, this hardly seems to be in line with international law.
Yeah, these are common fishing boats. You see them all over the Venezuelan coast. They're very small. They don't go very far. You have 2 outboard motors and whatever gas you can carry. There's no way you can fit enough fuel on those boats to reach the United States. None of them are heading to the United States. None of them. Most of them are heading to Trinidad and Tobago, which is just a few kilometers away from the state of Sucre in Venezuela, and has historic ties with Venezuela. There's a Venezuelan community in Trinidad, and there's a Trinidadian community in Venezuela. These boats are involved sometimes in smuggling people, smuggling liquor, goods, including cocaine. There's no fentanyl in these boats. The fentanyl is coming through the US-Mexico border, and to the extent that it's first coming from South America, it's coming through the West Coast. Like most of the cocaine, 95% of it is coming to the United States through Colombia, across to Ecuador, which is controlled by a U.S. ally, President Daniel Noboa, a very repressive billionaire president who was born in Miami, whose family represents a major Latin American oligarchic clan that gained their wealth through the Bonita fruit fortune. And if you are watching this now, just do a simple Google search for Bonita bananas and cocaine, and you will see that cocaine is being shipped to Europe through Bonita cartons of bananas, because it shows up as organic material inside the bananas, and that Daniel Noboa has been, before he was president, the shipping director for the Bonita company, for his family, the Noboa family company. It's very clear that he was involved in drug trafficking, and that the family fortune is intertwined with narco trafficking, and that they have been working with the Albanian mafia to get cocaine into Europe and the United States. Marco Rubio, after his last trip to South America, was on stage with Daniel Noboa, painting him as a key partner in the new U.S. war on drugs. It's not a war on drugs. It's a war to control the drug trade. And the United States has no intention of stopping this. If the United States had any intention of stopping its society from being poisoned by drugs, then why have close Donald Trump associates like Rudy Giuliani, who was Trump's lawyer, served as a lawyer for simultaneously for Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family, which was responsible for the opioid crisis that killed millions of Americans, particularly in the Rust Belt in Trump country. Marco Rubio has been involved in big pharma-sponsored legislation, which made it harder for the DEA to prosecute doctors and pharmaceutical companies that were selling opioids on the black market, killing millions of Americans. So they're not actually interested in stopping the poisoning of America. This is just a pretext. And what they managed to achieve through these killings of people on fishing boats, including Trinidadian citizens, Colombian citizens whose boats have just drifted into the area of the zone of conflict. What they've achieved is they've managed to justify bringing an entire carrier fleet into the region and escalate the militarization of the Caribbean on a phony pretext. So that's all this is just a pretext to generate a massive naval show of force, which will then be used to take out the so-called narco lord, Nicolas Maduro, or his associates. And what is Nicolas Maduro said to be in charge of? It's called Cartel of the Suns. There is currently a $50 million bounty over the head of Nicolas Maduro for to kill or capture him. The U.S. Department of Justice has increased that from $15 million in, I believe, 2018. And that's the same sum, by the way, 50 million, that was placed over the head of Osama bin Laden. What is the Cartel of the Suns? It's something that doesn't exist. There is no Cartel of the Suns. The Suns were sun patches that were worn by the members of the Venezuelan National Guard before the Chavez era in the early 90s. And these were figures who were recruited by the DEA and CIA, specifically the CIA. Their main point of contact was General, I believe, Rafael Guillen, in order to ship cocaine into the United States. Yeah, it sounds crazy. The plan was to, in the words of the CIA, let the dope walk. And by allowing 20 tons of cocaine to be shipped into the United States via Venezuela, with these National Guard figures basically being ordered by U.S. intelligence to let this happen, they would be able to track supposed drug trafficking routes, see who the drug traffickers were in U.S. cities, and they actually poisoned their own society. I mean, I can tell you, having grown up in Washington, D.C., I saw our cities change right before my eyes. I watched the crack epidemic unfold right before my eyes, and everybody in D.C., at least the black majority of the city, they all knew where it was coming from. It was coming in under the watch of U.S. intelligence. It was coming from the cartels that they were working with. And so the CIA created the Cartel of the Suns. And then the Cartel of the Suns gradually disappeared, and they just revived it in order to justify what could be the targeting of the Venezuelan government, simply because they're socialists who are sitting on top of the world's largest oil reserves, and they're not U.S. stooges like Danielle Noboa.
Well, you mentioned that if they decide to launch this invasion or decapitation strike, it could, well, most very likely result in a civil war within Venezuela. It could probably spark a huge exodus of refugees, which would be heading towards the U.S. border, which would make the problem felt there as well. But I guess my last question is about the consequences in terms of how it would be received in the wider region, because like on one hand, Venezuela often has a troubled relationship with its neighbors, but I've been to Colombia a few times, and the the criticism and a bit hostility towards Venezuela there was quite obvious among the military. However, now it seems to have shifted quite dramatically. How do you? Of course, it's a different government than Santos and Uribe and those who preceded him. But how do you see the wider region in Latin America reacting to, I guess, a massive U.S. attack in this manner?
Well, if you're talking about Colombia, it's important to understand how Colombian society has suffered because of the US assault on Venezuela. The sanctions, the unilateral sanctions that the US has imposed on Venezuela were responsible for the migration waves, and they passed through Colombia. And Colombia, which is already a poor country that has experienced its own traumatic history with civil war and the drug war, had to absorb hundreds of thousands of migrants. And this put enormous pressure on them. So, do they want to have their border destabilized again by a full scale Libya style US operation? I don't think so. So, this transcends left and right. In Colombia, however, there is the Uribista faction of Jose Uribe and his associates, the kind of political wizard J.J. Rendon, Ivan Duque, the last president who was the main partner for the Trump administration in assisting the assault on Venezuela, that will cooperate with anything the U.S. wants to do. The president of Colombia right now, Gustavo Petro, emerged from the student movement that opposed the right-wing dictatorship of Colombia, and he sort of represents the ability of Colombian society to overcome the trauma of the civil war and see past the entire Colombian left being portrayed as FARC guerrillas. And Petro has been extremely outspoken on the world stage, not only against the US assault on Venezuela, but also against the US-Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip. And this has put him in Trump's crosshairs. He is now being personally sanctioned by the US regime, and he has held several very large rallies in Bogota against U.S. militarization in the Caribbean. And as I said before, Colombian citizens have been killed in these U.S. airstrikes on boats. But Petro doesn't control the military. The military is infested with pro-U.S. right-wing elements. And so, I mean, he technically controls it, but he may not ideologically control it the same way that Maduro does in Venezuela with his military. And I know that the military also has had partnerships over the years in Colombia with right-wing militias. At the same time, you have FARC, the remnants of FARC in Colombia, which are formally or effectively aligned with the government of Venezuela. So you could see civil conflict pour over the border into a place like Colombia. To Venezuela's east, you have the government of Kamala Persad-Becesar, the Trinidad and Tobago president, who really represents the Indo-Trinidadian community and is very pro-US to the point that she is like basically ready to put on a MAGA hat. She's supported Trump consistently, and even after Trump's airstrikes killed Trinidadian citizens who, without any evidence that they were drug traffickers, she doubled down on her support for the U.S. show of force. And now the U.S. is holding joint drills in Trinidad, which is just a few kilometers from Venezuela. So Trinidad and Tobago has become the main staging point for the assault on Venezuela. And this has a larger meaning. The U.S. has, for a generation or several generations, sought to prevent the regional integration of the Caribbean nations, to keep them weak and fragmented, because integration would mean they become a powerful bloc with enormous human potential and resources. Kept separate, they're just a bunch of islands that with hardly any ability to travel between one another. And the middle of the Caribbean is Cuba, which, as I mentioned, is the prize for Rubio. So this is bringing the U.S. back to the Monroe Doctrine, back to the Banana Wars, when the U.S. Marines invaded Haiti and stole its gold in Port-au-Prince, when the U.S. Marines invaded Nicaragua and appointed a conservative puppet president in order to depose the Nicaraguan liberals, and were faced down with a heroic insurgency by Augusto Sandino in the forests of Nicaragua. This is where we're at again, and this is the mentality of the Trump administration. It's gunboat diplomacy for resources without any pretense of spreading democracy whatsoever. And they may not actually know what they're dealing with.
It seems like a very unfortunate reaction to the multipolar moment that is to seek to shore up a complete US dominance in the
Right.
Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I mean, that's another point is China. I mean, China has been forming strong relations across the Western Hemisphere. Um, I mean, first thing you see when you land at Mexico City's airport are ads for Huawei technology. Venezuela has signed several cooperation agreements with China. The US, if there is going to be a multipolar world, at least the Trump administration, but I think this transcends, Republican and Democrat. Washington wants to control the entire Western Hemisphere and keep China out. And that's a major objective here.
Yeah, obviously was evident in Panama as well.
Oh yeah,
Well,
great point.
yeah, taking over that. Anyways, thank you for letting me pick your brain, and yeah, I'm hoping it won't come to an actual attack, but it does appear we're heading very quickly in that direction. So
Well, as Madeleine Albright, the war-crazed former Secretary of State, said to Colin Powell, when you have the world's largest military, you have to use it. And that seems to be the overriding mentality here with Venezuela.